In 2026, one of the most unlikely places on Earth just became the center of a very modern showdown: Greenland. Mostly ice, mostly empty. And suddenly, it's tied to a threat that could hit European wallets, disrupt trade, and strain alliances. As of January 18, 2026, multiple reports say President Donald Trump has threatened escalating tariffs on goods from several European countries unless the United States is allowed to acquire Greenland. The tariff numbers being reported are blunt: an additional 10% starting February 1st, rising to 25% by June 1st. And the list of countries being discussed is not small: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, and the United Kingdom. So what's going on here? Is this a negotiating tactic, a political message, or the opening move in a deeper shift in how the US uses economic pressure, this time against its closest allies? To understand why this is such a big deal, you have to start with two simple truths. First, Greenland is not for sale in any ordinary sense. Greenland is a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. Greenland's leaders have repeatedly said their future should be decided by Greenlanders.
The future of Greenland is a decision for Greenland and for the Kingdom of Denmark.
Danish officials have rejected the idea of selling it. And across Europe, the reaction to the idea of buying territory is immediate. Sovereignty is not a commodity. Second, Greenland matters more than most people realize, not because it's trendy, but because it's strategic. The story here is less about a piece of land and more about what that land represents in a world that's increasingly competing over geography, supply chains, and security. Let's start with the basics. Why Greenland? Greenland sits at the top of the Atlantic, between North America and Europe. That location is not just a dot on a map. It's a piece of the Arctic that defense planners have cared about for decades. In Cold War terms, it sits near corridors used for monitoring movement across the North Atlantic, routes that matter for submarine tracking, missile warning, and the broader question of who controls access between continents. Then there's the US military presence. The United States operates a major facility in Greenland, Pituffik Space Base. This isn't symbolic. It's tied to missile early warning and space surveillance, systems that are part of how modern deterrence works. In other words, Greenland is already connected to US national security. The US is already there. The question is whether Washington wants more control, more certainty, and more leverage in the Arctic's next chapter. Because the Arctic is changing. The climate factor is a background engine in this entire story. Even if you strip out politics, sea ice patterns are shifting. That affects access, navigation, and the long-term feasibility of shipping routes and resource development in some seasons. It doesn't mean the Arctic becomes an open highway overnight, but it does mean the region is moving from too remote to matter toward too important to ignore. And finally, minerals.
Greenland may look like a frozen wasteland, but beneath its sides lies one of the most geopolitically and climatically significant regions on Earth. Greenland's melting ice is exposing vast mineral wealth critical for clean energy and reviving old power struggles.
Greenland is widely discussed as having significant mineral potential, including rare earth elements and other materials used in advanced electronics and defense-related supply chains. In a world obsessed with supply security and increasingly nervous about dependence on any single country, anything linked to critical materials becomes more than an economic story. It becomes a strategic one. Now here's where the tariffs come in. Tariffs are not just a policy detail, they're a weapon. A tariff is effectively a tax on imports. It raises costs. It shifts purchasing behavior. It can force companies to reroute supply chains. But it also sends a message. We are willing to impose economic pain to get what we want. Used carefully, tariffs can be bargaining tools. Used bluntly, they become coercion. And coercion is where alliances start to crack. So why target these specific European countries? The reported list includes Denmark, which is the obvious link, because Greenland is tied to the Danish realm. But it also includes a broader set of Northern and Western European allies. And the context being discussed in reporting is that several of these states are tied to NATO cooperation and Arctic posture. In other words, the very countries showing up to reinforce Allied unity in the region are being told that unity comes with a cost. That is why Europe's reaction has been so sharp. European officials have described the reported linkage between tariffs and Greenland as unacceptable. The language being used in public comments, words like blackmail, is not normal diplomatic tone between allies, and the wider EU discussion has reportedly moved toward coordinated responses, including potential retaliation and consideration of legal instruments designed for moments when economic pressure turns into political coercion. This matters for one simple reason. Trade disputes between allies are common, but trade pressure tied to territorial demands is in a different category. And that brings us to the next layer of the story: NATO. If Greenland is a strategic space, and it is, then it's also a NATO-relevant space. The strength of NATO is not just military hardware, it's trust. Trust that allies will show up. Trust that allies won't turn economic pain into political punishment. Trust that disagreements stay inside the boundaries of democratic norms and diplomatic rules. When that trust is tested, the consequences don't always show up immediately. They show up in slow, compounding ways. It affects how leaders talk about future cooperation. It affects how defense budgets get justified to voters. It affects whether joint exercises feel like unity or like leverage. And it affects how rivals interpret the situation. Because while this is a US-Europe drama on the surface, Russia and China are watching. They don't need to do anything dramatic to benefit from allied friction. If unity weakens, the Arctic becomes easier to contest, diplomatically, economically, and over time, militarily. That doesn't mean conflict is inevitable. It means opportunity grows where cohesion shrinks. So what happens next? There are two key dates that create a pressure cooker. First is February 1st, when the initial tariff step, reportedly 10%, is described as starting. Second is June 1st, when the rate is described as rising to 25%. Those dates force decisions: negotiate, retaliate, delay, or call the bluff. Denmark has signaled intensified diplomatic engagement. Europe has reportedly been coordinating possible responses, and markets have reacted with visible discomfort because tariff fights rarely stay neatly contained. Even the threat of tariffs can shift prices and expectations. Companies don't wait for a policy to become permanent before they start planning for it. And in the background, there's the biggest question of all: what is the actual end game? Is the Greenland demand a serious policy objective? Is it a leverage play meant to extract concessions from Denmark and Europe in another area? Is it political theater aimed at projecting strength? Or is it part of a broader strategy to lock down Arctic advantage, minerals, and infrastructure before the next decade reshapes the region? You can argue different possibilities, but the stakes are not small. Because if the reported approach becomes normal, using tariffs against allies to demand territorial outcomes, it sets a precedent. And precedents, in geopolitics, rarely stay confined to one situation. So here's the takeaway. Greenland is no longer just a frozen island that most people forget about. It's now a stress test for trade relations, for sovereignty, and for NATO unity. It's also a symbol of the world we're moving into, where geography matters again, supply chains are strategic, and economic pressure is used like a foreign policy tool. The next chapter will be written quickly. If the February deadline hits with real action, Europe will be forced to respond. If Europe responds strongly, the standoff escalates. And if both sides dig in, this stops being a Greenland story and becomes a broader story about the future of the transatlantic relationship. So what do you think happens next? Is this a negotiating tactic that ends in a quiet compromise? Or is Greenland the start of a bigger realignment, where allies are treated less like partners and more like leverage? If you want part 2 when the February deadline lands, subscribe and leave a comment. Is Greenland a bargaining chip or the next geopolitical fault line?